Rochelle Potker is an award-winning poet, fiction writer, and screenwriter, and an alumna of prestigious international writing program in Iowa. Her writing has traveled across India, Asia,
Recording
Europe,
in progress.
and the US, earning accolades such as Norton Giro Prize, the Great Indian Poetry Contest, and multiple international shortlists. Her books, From 4 Degrees of Separation to Bombay Hangovers, and her award-winning poems have placed her among the most exciting contemporary writers. What makes her voice truly remarkable is her ability to blend emotional insights with urban realism, creating narratives that feel both intimate and universal. Today, she brings that mastery to us, crafting emotional, engaging stories, where she will help us understand how stories become alive, how they breathe, resonate, and stay with us after the last line. We are honored to have you with us today, ma'am.
Thank you.
Handing over to you.
And I'm glad that of the many, at least there are 4 to 5 screens lit up, because otherwise it's talking to a black box. So this is the first sharing anything where creative writing is supposed to draw a bridge or draw parallels to creative non-fiction, whether it's journalism, whether it's reality-based long-form writing. And so I had to set out myself to contemplate on how does this draw a bridge, and would I be able to actually draw the bridge, draw parallels enough? But I brought a lot of tenets and reflections in my gunny bag, hoping that maybe we will find some semblance. It's a real challenge for me as well, because day in and day out as a fiction writer, I have been practicing characterization and storytelling, setting, creating atmosphere behind the settings. It's become so organic and so natural that only when you need to, give a talk like this, do you need to externalize what all you may be following organically or in a very subconscious way. So I think storytelling, whether it was fiction or non-fiction, whether it was reality-based or not, was from the most ancient art of storytelling around a bonfire. We always told stories, whether we gossiped, whether there was a lot of truth in it, whether there was lies in it, whether there was a slant, whether there was prejudice, whether there was the relevance or irrelevance of the traditions of those times, that is left to be questioned. Because what was relevant, say, in one era may not be relevant today. What was a taboo topic then might be passé today. But at the same time, storytelling, how much of truth did it hold and how much of imagination it had, was one thing. But there was storytelling. Storytelling was as ancient an art form that people had to feel this shared camaraderie and this collectiveness by telling stories around a bonfire, because it was before the invention of electricity, and it brought together a shared view on culture. It brought people together, but sometimes it also propagated things that could be dangerous, like cult religions or cult sects or prejudice or witch hunts. So it could go positive as well as negative. And I think that's true for any art form or even a word. I consider a word is a weapon and a story is a weapon. And whether the story has a fiction or non-fiction or elements of reality, it still is a weapon that can go against or for humanity as a whole. I think besides the genres of fiction and non-fiction that we talk about, there's something today which is fake news or fake narratives, which is doing the rounds all the time. And we see that happening everywhere, even in the way, let's say a recent case where a celebrity is unwell and he's already, a published obituary has happened in a big newspaper. That becomes fake news, or that becomes preemptive news, or that becomes breaking, or I say barking news. So how do we manage fake narratives in today's day and age? I think for me, the conspiracy theories as a fictionist holds a better magnetism and interest than fake news, because fake news can be dangerous. Conspiracy theories, however, are dangerous, no doubt, but they're also, because they are based and surrounded around such large topics that it's not one individual that can cause a lot of damage, but it does give a lot of uh, food for thought and platter for imagining, I don't know, fiction movies and books and a lot of entertainment. So I just found some of them which have been, like doing the rounds world over, and they have been churning out and churning out a lot of fiction, and sometimes fact looking fiction, and they never end, and you have so much of things that you could do with it. So much of material is churned daily. And I'm talking about the way, when we consumed media earlier, we only had the television, or we only had cable channels, cable TV. But then with the expansion of everything, the internet, there are so many different ways of consuming news, so many different ways of consuming information. So how do you know? How do you know what is fact, what is fiction, and how much of it is being put together? So I find at least the conspiracy theories have some entertainment value, if nothing else. I wanted to read a poem, just as because I don't have much of. I'm not a journalist, but I did manage to write something one day, and I thought this would be a kind of a tribute, because I'm talking to people from journalism, and this is the only poem I have around that. The genesis of this poem, it's a 2-minute poem. Genesis of this poem came about when I thought of what absolute freedom could a woman have. What if she was a country? If I were a country, as a woman, would it be absolute freedom? Could I have my own flags and insignias and military and defense systems, and own language and own time zones, and would that be absolute freedom? And then I thought, no, even a country cannot is not free really. It has bonds and bondages. It also decides between humanitarian values and economic trade, and that's why it decides its politics. So even a country is not completely free. But then I had already written this poem, which is a kind of a violent love story in a poem called Surrender. If I were a country, you would be a journalist. And because you are not an empty-headed bloke out for a quick fix, but investigative, committed idealist, I would have shot you down a street and left you to bleed. If I were a country and you my journalist, it would be a civil war, one too many revolutions, changes in governments. I would have jailed you and kept you on CCTV. If I were a country and you my journalist, I would have played a wait and watch game to see who wears the other, sleep deprived, akin to a Russian sleep experiment. But the more you stare, the more beautiful someone becomes. Remember, the more you stare, the more beautiful someone becomes. Remember, many pass the cellars of my mind, few the cellars of my heart. I would blink first. I would blink first. I would give in from dictatorship to democracy. If I were a country and you my journalist, I would let you run a free press and media to change the face of an entire nation. I hope that was okay. All right, thank you so much. Because I can only see 4 people actually. Yeah. All right. So, so coming to it, so I decided that I'm going to draw parallels or bridge, try to create some thought bridges between fiction and non-fiction or creative writing, and probably from here we will be able to find something that we could mosaic together. Because seriously, I sometimes feel that fiction is so much of lies and deceit, but it's on your face. No one says that it needs to be verified completely. So I thought of the first novel that I wrote, which is the DaCosta family, and I thought about what amount of research did I do and what was the amount of imagination that was there. And when I looked at this story, of course it was written in the black comedy genre. Okay, and it was written around the time period of 1960 to 1990 in a place called Kalyan, which I changed. This place called Kalyan, for those people who don't know, Kalyan is near, it's a satellite town near Bombay. And in the 90s, it was much slower. It was like a Malgudi. Time moved slowly. Only now everything is as fast with malls and multiplexes and lots of more population. But at that time, it was a slower place. Sometimes I felt that time didn't move at all. Like when I lived there, I thought it moved backward. So there was this sense of standstillness and this aspirational restlessness of wanting to come to the city, wanting to come to Bombay. Bombay being the aspirational city where all your dreams come true. Of course, now I live in Bombay and I think it's not the promised land and the promised land is somewhere else. But that apart, let's not talk about that. I'm talking about what was the research I had to do and where could I actually be the Feku Chand that I am, because I'm a fictionist. So uh, I had first changed the name of Kalyan so that I didn't have to keep to the historic facts. And that's what you can easily do in fiction. And it gives you this large breadth because you don't have to verify historically what happened, who was there during that time. Uh, I'm talking about goons and guns, so I could mix and match whatever I wanted, but not completely without any research, using memory, using nostalgia maybe, using keen sense of observations, but playing around to the creative license that fiction writers have. So I have a paragraph here which I thought about, which is fiction, and then I want to show you what it would sound, in non-fiction and poetry. If you want to just take 2 minutes to read it silently. Just give me a thumbs up when you finish reading. Yeah. So basically, the story is about the matriarch Rita DaCosta, who wants to basically have all the gold and the money back and a property back from her elder son Pedro, and because there's a family feud between the DaCostas and which are Goans, and the Anglo Indians, that is the Joseph family. So in this family feud, she's like the old Juliet who's married into the enemy Romeo's house. It's not that here that Juliet loves Romeo. She's an old protagonist who's waiting to take revenge, and she uses her friendship with her daughter-in-law Annette to try to get all the gold and the money back. And all her schemes will fail because this is a black comedy, so you're trying to expose the greed that is there in the generations, and how does the vicious cycle of greed break between the landlord and the landlady's home and the tenants, and this B story which happens to be the plot that goes into redevelopment. So here this story has I needed to focus on where did Rita DaCosta come from, what was her genesis, and one of the ways to look at was where did her father come from, where did the grandfather come from, because she's an Anglo-Indian. And I had to cook up this history, this backstory, because it's fiction, but at the same time it needs to look as close to it needs to be relatable, and it needs to seem like it's real. And so it needs to be a very important and clever lie. And when I look at the same thing, if I was writing non-fiction, it would be something like this, wherein I would use a lot of reportage like phrases, because I would need to distance myself. Please give me a thumbs up if you've finished reading this. I think this is closer to what you would have written, because as creative non-fiction writers. So what I realize is the difference between is the way you have to distance yourself, because it needs to be either verified, or then you have to put phrases in between that that show that you are an observer here and you don't know this with confidence. You are not in the immediate presence. Whereas I notice that when you're a fiction writer, you can bluff and bullshit, and you can just say that you were right there and you're God, and everyone will believe that yes, you were there and these things happened. So I realize that this is a very challenging way to speak truth, to frame truth, or to if it is unverifiable, how you make sentences that do not keep you too proximate to it, to the chronicler or the narrator. And I found that it's very challenging to write that. And of course, if this was a poem, it would have been something like this, which would again take you on a little abstract tour. So I began to think, what is emotionally engaging stories, and how do you draw the bridge between the two? And one of the most important things in fiction is characters. And so I assume, and I know that in reality it's people. And so what is the difference between characters and people? Because in my head, all people are characters and all characters are people. I mean, I wouldn't be able to tell you of the 100 characters in my head that they're not people. So you could consider me mad or insane. And that is the difference, because for me it is the same. So, but I know for you it is not the same. If you're writing creative nonfiction, or you're following up a story, it is a person. But for me, the character is also the person, and the person is the character. And for me, there is a distance which is almost not well, actually. It's an unwell distance. That when I see a person, sometimes I'm so benumbed, because in my head I'm thinking like a fiction writer and thinking, oh, that was a very good trait. Oh, you saw the way that person cried? Or you saw the way the person laughed? But I'm like, no, I'm a little distanced, right? So I also think about sometimes empathy and apathy and how that's forming, not just in me because I'm a fiction writer, but the way we are looking in the same screens, crossing a Gaza genocide and crossing a funny dog picture or a funny dog dance and some AI ramp walk of Bollywood stars all at the same time. So on one hand, you will be looking at something and it seems everything is unreal, everything is fiction. And you start losing the cognizance of what is really happening, or is this again fiction? But coming back to it, characters and people, that is one of the most engaging things that happens. And this is something which I think you know, but this is what are the core things or the core tenets that I look at when I look at fiction. And it's the iceberg of what we are on the top and what we are below. So if it is for me, I would say this is what you know about me as a biographer, and these would be the other things, in my biography, bio note, and these are the other things that I might be, some of them, not everything, but this is the other things I might be, which no one knows, and I don't put that in my biography necessarily. So what does a character or a person have? Because you would definitely not look at them, just a second, I'm just trying to pull this, yeah. You would not look at it as a character, you would look at it as a person, but the same approach would be followed, of course, with much more humanity and humanization, because again, when I'm looking at characters, I can play around with them. I can give them a wound or a ghost or a childhood trauma. I could give them anything that I wanted because I can afford it. I could say, okay, this person has a very major childhood trauma, because it's not real. So I could play around with them much more. Whereas for you, you have to humanize a person who already is going through a trauma, because they are real people. So the difference is completely is different. You are following the person, but what are you following when you are following? You're following what is seen of the person on top, and everything else that you are researching, every little research and element is going to humanize this person. So when the reader is reading, even if they are not reading fiction, they know it very well. They are following the person and the event that has occurred. They are so, it is so relatable that they are so connected to the person, and they want to follow that story, and they want to know more and more about what has happened to that person. And I feel somewhere that as humanity, we are all on these journeys where it never ends with one event. so what you call sensationalism. It never ends there. Life keeps happening and stories keep happening, whether they are fiction or they are fact. And people, even with goldfish attention spans, want to know what happened to that person after this. Or even if they don't want to know, but you want to tell them and you are interested, it makes a difference. So definitely the chronicler's interest makes a huge difference. But I feel these are the things which, when researched about that person, humanizes the person. So when you are telling that story, whether it's fiction or it's fact, it's relatable enough. It may not be likable enough, but it is relatable enough for the reader to follow story after story of this person. Yeah. I come to the Jungian archetypes. This is very common. I think you'll know about it. And but in fiction, we have now nearly 200 archetypes, because there are sub archetypes, there are modern archetypes. You keep going on and on. But basically, in these 12, this is like the fulcrum where you see it's between the self, ego, and soul, and it's guided by the people or the characters that are
Dear participant, please mute your mic.
yeah. So it's guided by the characters or the people who want to leave a mark or who want to connect with people. There will be different traits. People who are on a spiritual journey, or they want to provide structure. So you are going to have this, and I think even whether we know it or not, we come across so many people. We almost put them in buckets and of archetypes, not stereotypes, I hope, but archetypes, because we see newer and newer archetypes coming about. Like recently, I was on Instagram and I came across how the way the word Randi is being reclaimed, and who is reclaiming it, and why there is somebody calling it. Why is there a debate about Savarna feminism and Dalit feminism with the word Randi? Whether there should be something like that, whether an expletive or a cuss word can be appropriated by the woman who it is targeted to. Can it blunt that? Like nationalist was a word long ago, or an anti-nationalist was a word long ago. It was blunted because it was reclaimed. It was kind of it dissipated. So will the word Randi currently be dissipated because it's brought into conversation and being reclaimed? And then there are these other things that I just happen to see, just some funny little archetypes which are hashtags in today, and how we come across people and we immediately have that lens of how we categorize them based on where they're coming from and where they're going. I feel to write relatable characters, at least in fiction, is the most important, work that we have, or pre-work that we have before we start a story. And many a times they say whether a character is likable or not, the character needs to be relatable. And I think relatability also comes from agony, because you're talking of a protagonist. And when you're talking of a protagonist, you're talking about the agony, because it's protagony. So you're talking of the agony. And agony is very important, because we don't laugh as much as we cry. We have more troubles in our lives than we have solutions, more problems than we have solutions. I think in a day when I was thinking of doing the Hasya Rasa in DaCosta Family, I was feeling guilty, because I was situated as a writer around plane crashes, around Gaza genocide, and I was thinking, can I permit myself to laugh? Because how much do we laugh in a day than the amount of seriousness that we need to give life to find solutions, to approach it. But coming back to that, what happens is that agony. The protagonist, or the word, comes from agony itself. It doesn't come from comedy. Even though you can have ends of Aristotelian comedy or tragedy, you generally have agony in the protagonist that you follow. And then you have, you have simple things we use in fiction, like the personality traits, detailing, how they spoke, how they sat. I think every detail makes a difference, because if you are the person interviewing your subject, but I am not the person who's seeing the subject, whatever details you provide to me draws that and brings it into immediacy and reality. So what details do you pick up? Do you pick up the style and voice of the subject? Do you pick up the dialect? the way they spoke? Do you pick up other things? Do you pick up their pain? Whatever you pick up, whatever you choose to write, makes a difference to me because I'm not seeing that character. I'm assuming I'm not seeing them on TV either because now we have a lot of news which is scrollable. I think now everything is live streamed. There is a difference between when you relied only on the published word. Now you also have live streamed news wherein everything is so close to you. It comes to you faster than it's being curated. But it still is the role and responsibility of what you detail and how you detail it to humanize that character. And then when I think about it, I think about antagonisms. And I'm not calling it an antagonist, I'm calling it antagonisms because it becomes a little more broader scope because you sometimes may not have a person who is against you, the villain, or against the material that you are following, but it is the system as a whole. It could be the society, it could be world politics, it could be larger than life things which are outside the frame. It could be natural calamities. So it is the antagonisms that when you look at, but when you look at an antagonist in fiction, you do know that they are the heroes of their stories. Every antagonist feels that they are the hero of their story. They are the protagonists of their stories. And that's why their scripts are so strong. That's why they are shocked when their self-belief systems are questioned, because their scripts were that they were the center of their narrative. But from the antagonisms always comes conflict, always comes drama, and comes the antithesis. The antithesis we will talk about a little later in the Hegelian dialectic. But this is a place, or they say in fiction, as strong as your antagonist, so strong will your protagonist be. Because your protagonist will have to surmount whatever your antagonist is putting in the way to become stronger. So in fiction, a strong antagonist is very needed. I'm not sure the same thing about real life. I don't think I would want broken systems as a citizen to function in. I don't think I would want anarchy. I don't think I would want sexual violence happening day and night in the streets. I don't think I was going to become stronger and more resilient. I would probably be freaked out. So I think this works for fiction because in this crucible, because you can play around a lot, you do play around. And I think we aspire to have less drama in reality, but more drama in fiction. We are trying to resolve the dramas of reality, but we are entertained by all the drama and the chaos and the conflict in fiction. And I think that is a better way to be. I wouldn't want the opposite. So I started to think about what really is the ratio of research and imagination between fact and fiction. And if I'm just talking about the two books that I've written, one which is going to come up, the proportion of fact and fiction was Swadanusar, right? Was Swadanusar. The moment I realized that my research is going to bury my imagination, I stop. The moment I realize that my research is going to bury my plot, I stop. Because the research is Swadanusar. I will research to the point that it is relatable, it is logical, it is relevant, it is believable, but it should not overtake what I want to talk, because I'm into the suspension of disbelief. However, in creative fiction, I think research is the 100% brick or the foundation stone on which you base everything, and you cannot get that wrong, and you keep verifying that till the point that you have the best source and the rightmost source. But I also think it's coming from the left brain, right brain, because why do I tend as a writer not to be analytical, even if I am, not to write verified analytical pieces as much as I want to write, surrealistic, suspension of disbelief, because it's, I think, to do with the right brain, left brain, of how we are blessed with, and then how we hone and tone ourselves to. So there is definitely a leaning that goes. I remember of the two books that I wrote, one is coming up in Jan, but DaCosta family didn't require much research because all the members of that DaCosta family and Joseph's family were my family in a Goan Catholic community in Kalyan that I just hijacked and changed their names and distorted and exaggerated them. So did I need to do any character work? I didn't have to do even character work like a fictionist has to do. I didn't even have to do that much because they were ready-made characters for me. All I had to do is have super fun and some little revenge, but a good sort of revenge, because they were this nice family that I didn't want to kind of demonize. So I just had a lot of fun by giving them Portuguese hangovers and calling them dons and capos, and giving them some crazy little greedy thing about real estates. Because I think when I came to Bombay, I realized about what real estate or a square footage of land means. What does a piece of owning your own house mean? Because in an island city, you have such little space. That's when you realize what is home in a square foot of place. Yeah, so you go back telescoping time to understand that you had wider spaces outside the island cities. And of course you get a little envious about large sprawling bungalows, say in Jaipur or Delhi or anywhere, and you're like, oh my god, you are with a city that's very stringent in space, but you see that. So but what does space mean to people? What does it mean? It's a home. And what does home mean? Even 1 square foot which is robbed here or there, it means something. And the whole drama comes out from, you robbed my compound wall, or you robbed my papaya tree. I mean, I had gone to launch this book in Goa, and one of the readers said that there were neighbors who didn't speak for 30 years just because the hen of one neighbor had walked to the other neighbor's compound and laid an egg there. So whose egg was it? And the whole fight started because of whose egg was it actually. And because of that, then it escalated into different other fights, and they didn't speak for 30 years just because of that. So when you ask, why did a chicken cross the road? You must know it crossed it to create conflict. Yeah, even the chicken is too clever and smart. But coming back to it, so I didn't have to research much over the characters or the settings in Kalyan or for the DaCosta family. What did I do for the other novel, The Fabric Goddesses? I'll show you that later. It was about 3 women around the garment and fashion industry. One was in Dhaka, one was in Davangere, Bengaluru, and one was a model in New York. Now I had to research a lot for that because I cannot bullshit about sweatshops. I had to go to Dhaka and allow myself to open up to it without fearing that I will lose my story. See, that's the fear of a fiction writer, that you will lose that story with too much of research, but you have to allow that to seep in, to come in for osmosis. And even to Davangere, to just see what is the place like, because you're going to cover the atmospheric sensoria, you're going to cover characters that live there, what dialect do they speak, how are they dressed, so all those kinds of things. So there was a lot more research that went in the other one, though it stopped at some point where the fiction needed to continue. I think both for fiction writers and for any kind of writers, non-fiction writers, we always wonder, where is our story coming from? Where are our ideas coming from? And of course, Steven Johnson has prepared this for the fiction writer, perhaps, not for where the stories come from. I think our stories come from everywhere. At the same time, you will still see some people get remarkable stories, even in journalism, and you wonder, how did they get that? Because I think you are also, I have a lot of journalists who are friends, and they are also searching for a very good story, very interesting story, a nuanced story, a story that no one has heard of before. No one is always taking the same thing again and again, right? Because it starts becoming overtold. And we are also somewhere worried about the fatigue of the reader. How much can the reader take the same story again and again? I think if I read news the third time, I'm very annoyed if I read the same headline the third time in some other paper, because I already know it. It's not like I need to give an exam. So even news needs to be new, right? It can't be the same old news. But here he's talking about where do ideas come from, and he's talking of hunches, breakthroughs, and these things which I thought were very interesting, because these are the same places from which ideas come, and that is so many things, from adjacent possibilities to liquid networks wherein we're just talking. And I think a lot of stories come in the cigarette room, or when you're drinking, or when you're chilling, when you're showering, when you're gardening, when you're taking your dog for a walk. A lot of ideas come there. I think a lot of stories come from the liquid network of people just talking. Sometimes it comes from a very interesting word he's used here called adaptation, which means that you're planning to do something else and there is a byproduct, and that is the story, like penicillin, I think. So this entire thing of where you're going somewhere else and something else comes off. Then there is a slow hunch, there are errors, there is serendipity, and there are these other networks of various kinds. And I found this interesting because sometimes we don't, especially when I get asked that at workshops and festivals as to where do your ideas come from, and I'm like blank because I can only say the subconscious mind. How do we know? It's not conscious, it's very subconscious of how you pull in things, how you even pull up sensoria. Another thing that I want to talk about is the atmosphere and settings and place, which is very pertinent to fiction, but I think it's equally pertinent to non-fiction, because you are setting up the stage in a way of where this person and their event occurred. So I see a lot of creative non-fiction which has got very beautiful atmospherics, almost to the point of poetry. At the same time, not more than 2 sentences, because they need to run after the real story. But I do realize when they have used mist and echoes, and they have used all their senses in the way they have detailed it out, and you really feel you're there in and you're captivated and captured as you follow the person and the event. So atmosphere, setting, place matters a lot. It matters in fiction as well. The Navarasas, I don't know whether it is really applicable to non-fiction or creative writing or journalism, but it definitely has a very big place from the Natya Shastra to modern day in talking about how we use these 9 emotions, and especially in screenwriting. I'm also a screenwriter. In every granularity of a scene, when you design a scene from its beginning, middle, and end, to knowing what is the rasa you might be playing around with. And I'm saying might because it's not a manipulative creation, it is a very organic creation, but you somewhere are aware that I'm talking of a Shringhara rasa, and I might be talking about erotic love or romantic love or friendship wala love or paternal love or dog parent love. But whatever love I'm talking about, it is going to evoke a certain warmth in the audience, in the reader first, maybe the director, maybe the collaborators, but eventually if it goes on scene, it evokes a certain emotion in the audience. So I'm aware of the congruence of the rasa to the audience. So this is the awareness is not just in the 9 emotions, but if I employ hasya rasa, how does it affect the audience? Will they chuckle, giggle? Will they smile? Did they get it or did they not get it? So we are aware, but not in a manipulative way, but we are very aware of the rasas. And I feel sometimes that if many of the rasas are used in a story, I'm not talking of one story of say 2000 words, I'm talking of a length of a screenplay actually, or a novel. If you happen to use all the rasas, your audience is hooked like nothing else. So give them a point where there is a lot of quietude and peace. Give them also a point where it is restless and it is very disgusting. Give them a point which evokes compassion. Give them a point which is very it evokes warmth, love, or romance. I'm talking of larger stories because I don't think in 700 words or 2000 words you can actually bring all the navarasas. But I have seen films which I have absolutely enjoyed, and I'm like, okay, let me go back and analyze. Why did I enjoy? And I realized there were all the rasas here actually. I laughed, I cried, I was disgusted, I was angry, I was restless, I also felt sad, there was this emotion and that emotion, and there was this whole thali. And because of that, I was more engaged. And how did the creator do that? Because this is all something that doesn't come from your conscious mind as much as it comes from a very unconscious way of narrative. So I don't know whether this really kind of works in creative non-fiction, but it's a very beautiful template in fiction at least. Let me know if you need any, I mean, am I going too fast, slow? Is it okay? Like, everything's okay? Yeah, all right. Then we think about the structure of narrative. Now, I think the same structures more or less you also use in your articles, whether they are like, small pieces of 750 because of the newspaper constraints, or it is long form where you can write non-fiction books, but I think the same structure is used. Now the interesting part is this structure of the tension building, a conflict or a rising stake, a rising action, and then there is some denouement or there's a resolution. This doesn't happen only with a big form like say a big story, but even within the subsets. So if I was talking about a novel, it would happen even in the chapter. You would have a structure like that. Okay, if you're talking about a web series, each episode would have a structure like that. Even in the granularity of each scene, let's say I have 20 scenes in one episode of a web series. Each scene would also have this structure. So it is that cellular. Right, so we keep, and why do we have that cellularity? I think it is also to do with today's attention span. When somebody says, oh, 3 seconds, the first 3 seconds are very important. So what is the first 3 seconds? Is it the hook? Why is it so important? Why do you have to have the most important part told in the first 3 seconds? Whether it's on Instagram, whether it's in a movie on Netflix, what happens otherwise? People scroll, they swipe, they shut off, they zone out. Because we are also living in a very mutated world of fast consumption, impatient consumption. So I think this also works when you have your inciting incidents quicker, so that you drag the person in quick with what you're trying to tell, and then you move into rising conflicts or rising drama, and you eventually resolve. You have your antagonists, you have the obstacles. It's so similar to any way of storytelling. And I noticed that this is so instinctive that before I had learned about, I had not learned as much of organized storytelling, as much I went by instinctive or organic storytelling. So when I had written few stories, like short stories, and not a novel but a short story, so few successfully published short stories, some award winning, I had gone to organized learning, and that's when I learned about structures. And once I took an old story of mine that I was very happy with, and when I compared the structure, the story bent and turned exactly where they say the structure was to happen. So how did I know that? Because I feel we are organic and natural storytellers. You look at children, how they tell you something. Of course they are raw, but we are natural storytellers. We know when we need to bend here, because we are our first consumers. We cannot bore ourselves. That is the fundamental rule. We cannot bore ourselves. So, in order to not bore ourselves, we don't bore anyone else. We know where to turn. We know this is enough. Now you move to the next paragraph. Move to the next, the cascading issue. You move to the next. So this structure is actually inbuilt in us. It's also inbuilt in our mythologies. Like I hope you've heard of Joseph Campbell and his hero's journey. Yes. So Joseph Campbell and his hero's journey. What Joseph Campbell did is, in one fine phase of his life, he went around the world searching for the templates of mythology, world mythology. He wanted to see what is it in world mythology that is the same, the template. So you went to Greek mythology, Nordic mythology, probably African, Japanese, maybe Indic mythology, everywhere, to see what was the same thing. And he found the hero's journey in 12 steps. I don't have that here because I thought you would know that. But the hero's journey in 12 steps talk of the hero from moving out from the ordinary world to getting into the extraordinary world that will challenge this person. And this hero could be a male or a female. Challenge this person at every level and have pitfalls. You will meet with your friends and enemies. You will meet with grave troubles. You will meet with your mentors. You will fall. You will rise. You will be near death. You will survive, and eventually you will come through the 12 with elixir. And that elixir comes back to the ordinary world. So why is the hero's journey important? Because I think because we are all heroes inside ourselves. But if you look at the world through the hero's journey, you will see that mythology was not wrong per se most of the times. the template. Of course, you have different other, fiction writing templates, and that I think is a discussion for some other time, because that's extensive. But the hero's journey is not the only template you can follow. But I thought it was very logical in the way that you are called to a higher end, and you leave your extraordinary world that you love and you're very comfortable with to get into the extraordinary. So you leave your ordinary world to get into extraordinary world. You come back with new skills, new learnings, new friends and enemies, and you come with the elixir. The elixir marks the end of your journey. And that structure too is something which is innate in all of us. I think we all are on our own hero's journey or heroine's journey. There's another thing that comes to mind when I think about, I'm just looking at the time. Yeah. Another thing that comes to my mind is the shape of stories. Now, in fiction, we do have the shape of stories. And this is by Kurt Vonnegut. And he talks, these are not templates to be followed, they're just to be mused upon as to how does the shape of a story, like the man in the hold. So the beginning, middle and end is how he graphs it. And you see how interesting it is. And if you know the story archetype, then any story goes into these archetypes more or less. Okay, whether it is fact or fiction, it doesn't matter. How many real people we have seen, like men or women in the hole? Okay, how many have we seen about boy meets girl? So boy meets girl, then there are questions. Every love story follows this. Boy meets girl, then there are questions of whether that love will last or not. A lot of other problems and everything, and then they meet. From bad to worse is a story. Is a cautionary tale, right? It's a cautionary tale that you come across anywhere and everywhere, whether you're talking of world mythologies or you're talking of modern mythologies in the making. You come across bad to worse, which become cautionary tales. Which way is up is a confused person's story. It is very linear and it is very flat. You have the creation story of various kinds. These are with all the startup entrepreneurial or the underdog stories, the rags to riches. You have the Old Testament story wherein you have something else, and and then there's a gift from the deity, but then suddenly something else happens and you go down. New Testament stories, and you have the Cinderella story. I think the Cinderella story is another underdog story wherein things go up for a while, and then they can also come down. So these are, and I think these are of course the shapes of the stories given by Kurt, but I think we can have our own shapes of the story. It's nice to think about 3 acts. Because these become story archetypes then in that sense. And it's a nice way to look at Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. It's a very neat way to look at things. The Rashomon effect is something which I think you know better than me, of why narratives can keep changing, and borrowed from the film Rashomon. And what is the true narrative then? Because if everyone has a narrative of an event or an episode, then how do you verify what is true and how do you come to know? And I think sometimes in fiction that is very well done, especially in murder mysteries and thrillers or the usual suspects, where you come across the first witness is telling you this is how it happened, this is how I saw it, and this is what happened, and then you peel layer by layer in a whole procedural investigative way which really grips the audience. And it grips you as a creator also, because you're trying to solve a puzzle. And I think at the base of humanity, we were always trying to solve puzzles. We love puzzles. Give us a game in the middle of something and we are hooked. And then you solve this puzzle and you come to know that it was a Rashomon going on, and everyone was covering up and making it look like they were the most virtuous, and it was not so. There was this and that, and a whole police procedural or a vigilante detective story comes out from this, and it can run into series. But this is something that I think in how do you say, journalism, this is what as an audience you see. Somebody has said this and somebody has said this, somebody has got another shade of information, then something else khulasa ho jata hai, and those kinds of things. I think about dramatic irony very close to Rashomon's effect, because in fiction, just a sec. In fiction, we have something called the dramatic irony, which means that when you are a triangulate of a narrator or a creator or a storyteller, and you have the characters and you have the reader, so you are a triangulate. Now in that, who knows the most information? Now in I think in investigative journalism or in reality based narratives, you are finding the story. So you don't know as much, the audience doesn't know as much, but the person who is the subject or the source knows the most. But in fiction, you can play around with who knows more. So you can have the characters not knowing as much, but the audience, of course, the writer knows everything. The writer is God, the writer knows everything. The reader knows more than the character. Now, because the reader knows more than the character, the fun comes from that, because you're thinking, अभी इसको कब पता चलेगा कि ये ऐसा हुआ है? And it could lead to lots of comedy, it could lead to tragedy, it could lead to any of the genres you wanted to, it could lead to thrillers, it could, imagine the dramatic irony and what all possibilities are there with dramatic ironies. Yeah, it is never ending, the possibilities. So, I think this is, I'm not sure how you draw parallels with this, whether it makes sense in journalism at all, but it definitely is one of the most curious elements of storytelling, wherein the writer and the reader or the film team and the audience knows, and the characters don't know. So 2 characters know and 3 characters don't know, and the whole fun of it comes from that, whichever genre it may be, because you are then saying, because you feel Del Shana as an audience, because you're like, see, hey, isko nahi pata hai. But that's the fun of it. You're hooking. Basically, dramatic irony by the word drama is to hook the reader. So here we are into the business of hooking for attention. I know attention spans, and attention is a product or a commodity that everyone is trying to get hold of. Even news channels are looking for how do they get the attention of the audience. So I think there it matters. I'm not sure about the irony part. The stakes are something very important in fiction, and I think the stakes are very real in reality with people. They are not, they don't need to be created, but they come from reality. Because if the stakes rise, okay, the drama and the conflict rises. If the drama and the conflict rises, then if the drama and the conflict rises, the antagonist is stronger, and the protagonist needs to surmount the antagonist, and you are in a gripping tale at the edge of your seat. You're probably biting your fingers, or your nails. It becomes nail biting. So the stakes, but I think the stakes in reality or in journalism, they already are the stakes are right there. The stakes rise when, will this go to police? Will this go to court? Will this get justice? So the stakes are very real. Will they get equality? Will they stop being discriminated against? Will justice be served? These are real stakes. These are not, entertaining stakes. But in fiction, we have stakes which are entertaining, and you have the rising action coming from there. So if a protagonist was earlier, let's say, just going to lose the love of his life, or not lose the love of his life, but not get married to her, then it could sooner or later escalate to his life being in danger, right? So the stakes will rise. So the life and death is the biggest stake that's there. Nothing can be beyond that. Then you have small stakes like loss of property. It follows the Abraham Maslow's pyramid in a way, that you have safety, security, as stakes. You will have higher wealth as a stake. You may have intellectual theft as a stake. Whatever be the stake, whatever be the world order, third world, first world, rural, urban, but stakes are stakes. One thing I must mention to you, which I learned in Whistling Woods when I did an organized course, actually, a small course. My mentor said this very interestingly, that whatever the protagonist likes, the audience likes. That means they showed us, a little story where a boy wanted to save his hen, which was first, his father thought they bought a cock home, and they would want to chop it off on one Sunday and make some lovely curry. And the boy and the family realized it's not a cock actually, it's a hen, because it started to lay eggs. And this boy wants to save that hen because he loves his pet. So it doesn't matter whether cock or hen, he loves this pet and he wants to save it. So he's trying his own, jugglery of what he can do. And we are not really interested, we should not be interested in a chicken. Because we already are thinking like the father first. Chicken curry, that's it. But we are very interested because we're following the protagonist and we are following his agony of wanting to save his pet. And so we are so interested in whether this is a hen or whether this is a cock, or can that be saved, or why is it not being saved, and all that. So whatever the protagonist finds interesting, we find interesting. So then, of course, there is the settings which I already spoke about, the atmosphere and how you use sensoria and history. You will use more of it, of course, to verify it. But even as a fictionist, I don't think, unless I'm writing fantasy, can I just get away with saying anything. Of course, there is magic realism is one genre where I can get away by saying anything. I can say my biggest wishes, and that's normal. Like, you know what is the, when I teach magic realism workshops, I tell my students to just create a story world in which what is magical in the outside world is normal in your world. So if somebody says, I love to fly, so that is normal in your world, you are all flying. So now you tell me who's flying at which range, because there will always be a hierarchy, right? We don't get over with our societal hierarchies. So who's flying higher, who's flying middle, who's flying low, then you have a world order or a hierarchy or a structure. So we start with the magical being the normal in the story world. But if you're not writing that, if you're writing quite realistic fiction, even if it is, like whatever be it, even if it's fiction, you need to have very plausible parts of history or parts of the atmosphere. You can't say it was snowing in Bombay unless you're writing fantasy. You can't just say, sail through a snow in Bombay or something like that. So settings are important. And they keep saying this, which is actually, every child is told this, but I feel that it's so important to use your five senses when you write, because we tend to use only the visual sense more because it's such a visual world. We are so prone to image and imagery, and we don't use enough of sound anymore in our writings. I don't see much of sound. I don't see much of touch in the sense of how cold it was or how humid it was or those kinds of things. The Japanese also talk of memory being a sixth sense, but I think memory is always with us. But I think a lot more of the five senses. The way I look at it is the way you filter, information and things around you through your five senses. That is the way you inhale is the way you will exhale, basically. So it's also to keep all your five senses active, because that's the way you will take in and that's the way you will breathe out. Talking about the Hegelian dialectic, I think you know about this, but just as a revision, in fiction also we follow the thesis, antithesis and synthesis, where the thesis is mostly represented by the hero. You can take Batman. The antithesis would be the Joker, who's the antagonist, and the clash between the thesis and the antithesis is the entire story, which will give you the synthesis, which will be what they say in slang, na tumhara na mera, chalo beech ka kuch. And the beech ka kuch is the synthesis. And this keeps informing a society also as a whole. It informs storytelling and story universes. But when you keep having the thesis, antithesis, create new syntheses that inform new antithesis and thesis, you eventually have a very rich way and a rich culture and a rich layered society, because you are moving into, I won't say very intellectually debating two ideologies of schools of thought, but actually living out. It's more like living out, because I think we live out our thesis. I don't think in characters, you may live out your character, but as people, we live out our whole belief systems in our lives, right? I mean, we believe in this and this is our manifesto and we live it out that way. So our thesis is an entire lifetime. Our antithesis is the broken systems we are up against, injustices we are up against, and the synthesis is somewhere where we try to draw a bridge and maybe manage the pothole on the road and think about it being a portal to a multiverse. This is the story I was talking about, wherein I had to do much more research. This is upcoming, but here I had to do much more research into the sweatshops of Dhaka, into the city of Dhaka. Like, I didn't know till I went to Dhaka how that its rickshaws were like really needling. It's like this. It's so much more than Bombay. I thought that Nothing could outdo cities like Bombay, but no, there's Dhaka, and there's a lot of noise. So all those things you only get when you have to go there. But I think uh, this is not for you. Research is something which I think you come from a very more solid background than me in research. But I had to push myself out of the comfort zones of just fiction to understand that. What did I research as a poet? Some of the research I have done, like for example, my poem "Bedding Day," which I just read recently in Dehradun Festival. It's how do you say, from the viewpoint of a misogynist or an asshole. So, what I wanted to do is, I write in proper English, and I wanted to break through that corset of English and do improper English, or the Indian Englishes, which is plenty and which is very funny, right? It's all the time. You see that anywhere and everywhere. Like child beer, or you see, I don't know what. You see funny English everywhere. So I wanted to do a funny English poem, and without mocking the non-English speaker. So how do I make a protagonist? I don't mock the protagonist who doesn't know English, because that is one problem that Nizam Ezekiel, the critics of Nizam Ezekiel had, that while he wrote funny English, did he mock the people who didn't speak English properly? And it was called linguistic elitism. So how to get out of linguistic elitism? Because I wanted to have fun with English, and I love the way we all Indians speak English. But I didn't want to mock anyone because we are multilinguistic. But how do I manage it? And then I thought, what if I told my protagonist is a misogynist and he's an asshole? Then no one is worried about whether he speaks proper English or not, right? Because he's a misogynist. There are bigger things to deal with. And so Bedding Day came about, where I'm talking crap English from the viewpoint of a misogynist, and it really goes down very well. And I don't get accused for linguistic elitism, because I have none of that actually. Because I love Hindi so much. Okay, then Jallianwala Bagh mystic, I had a different way, because I had to research a lot into the history, because not only was I talking of the Jallianwala Bagh mystic, but I was talking about all the genocides that happened. This was before Gaza, of course. All the genocides that happened and all the tragedies that happened, from even the Sandy Hook massacre in school to all kinds of tragedies. Now, this could not be just written in one poem. You had to, even if you had a thought, generally you don't research for poetry, but some of the poetry I had to, if I had a small little idea that I want to write this kind of poem, I left it aside and really researched, because I had to do a lot of research just to have an osmosis of an incubation of what I wanted to put out there. It could not have been done without, because lots of poetry is just abstract, so then you don't need research. Even Willow Witching. Willow Witching was a poem on water harvesting, rainwater harvesting, and I didn't know what is a cistern or what is used on the terrace or those kinds of little things. So I had an idea, okay, I want to write about water and a woman who's running after clouds and rivers, but I don't want to write that yet. I want to know first what are those words called. I don't want to stop. You can't stop a poem in between. You can stop a story, you can't stop a poem in between. It's one exhalation. So it's like a lightning stroke. So you don't start that. You first research and then you come to write. So I have tried to even do that. So some research for poetry as well.
Well, thank you very much, and it was really great session. And
I would just like to present the vote of thanks to ma'am. As we bring this enriching session to a close, I would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to Ma'am Rochelle Potker for her wonderful insights this evening, for opening up the emotional architecture of a storytelling and showing us how narratives breathe, how characters carry truth, and how emotions become the bridge between a story and its reader.